Obsidian Entertainment consistently makes some of the all-time best 7 out of 10 RPGs, with a lot to love and a lot you have to look past or just get used to. I'm a huge fan, many are 10 out of 10s for me, and I've been cautiously looking forward to Avowed ever since it was announced. Pillars of Eternity holds a special place in my heart, and if you already know who I am, it's statistically most likely because you saw me gushing over it while comparing it to Baldur's Gate 3. So another game set in Eora was intriguing, but also the shift from isometric, mildly crunchy RPG to a first-person action game gave me pause because, you know, that's a big shift in design philosophy, and going for a flashier approach has historically resulted in less branching narrative and simpler dialogue systems. Then again, a new title and area of the world, disconnected from the exploits of the Watcher of Cadnua, means that this game is asking for more leeway to be its own thing in a familiar world. So again, I was tentatively looking forward to this. I've played The Outer Worlds, Obsidian's previous action RPG. The Outer Worlds was fun, but it had the unfortunate baggage of being partly advertised as New Vegas 2, and also being overshadowed by two of the best games ever made that came out the same year. Outer Wilds had a very similar title and was also a space game, though isn't similar otherwise. While Disco Elysium completely ate The Outer Worlds' anti-capitalist lunch by coming out 10 days earlier with deeper philosophy, sharper comedy and commentary, more emotional meaning, crunchier RPG mechanics, and more memorable characters. For different reasons, these transcendent pinnacles of the medium both attract easy comparisons to The Outer Worlds, which doesn't stand a chance. But let's not get our perception clouded by too much external stuff. The Outer Worlds is a fine game. Better than decent, but not great. I want to say it's even good because that's how I felt in the moment, but admittedly, a lot of it left my memory after I was done with it, and the only characters I remember being genuinely interesting were the rebels on Monarch and Parvati. But anyway, as I saw more pre-release stuff about Avowed, I prepared myself for history to repeat. And you know what? If I was wrong, it's only because I wasn't expecting Avowed to be as good as it is. I was surprised by how much Avowed feels like a Pillars game, even as it features a different gameplay design. This helps and hinders Avowed in different ways, which I will of course elaborate on shortly. It carries similar flaws to Pillars 1, while lacking some of that game's greatest strengths, but still carrying a pleasantly familiar feeling and featuring cool ideas of its own. Maybe in a year it'll slip from my mind, but right now I feel confident saying Avowed is a pretty good game. But yeah, $70 is a big ask for this. It feels very firmly AA, but is priced like AAA+. I wonder how much backlash Pentiment or The Forgotten City would get if they were the exact same games but with a $70 price tag. The first-person perspective of Avowed is, at a glance, highly evocative of Skyrim and Oblivion, which might be deceptive if it leads you to expect the sort of immersive sim-light world designs that those games prioritized over good RPG mechanics and storytelling. Avowed does not let you enter most buildings, kill non-essential NPCs, or sneak around to steal merchants' entire vegetable supplies. Instead, the NPCs all stay where they are, or have very limited walking routes. You can only kill people you're already in combat with, and NPCs let you swipe their valuables in plain sight without a word. Except Yatsley.
Good. You are aware I can see you digging through my things, aren't you?
The NPC animations and conversation blocking in these fully animated and voiced dialogues can also end up undermining immersion instead of enhancing it. Take this moment with a Solace Keep Cook, where he starts out too preoccupied with his work to notice that the envoy is an outsider at first, but the animation shows him looking directly at them. Or sometimes you'll walk in on NPCs as they're talking with each other, and their models will be turned towards you when the dialogue starts, even though they're written to not notice or acknowledge you yet. This is the exact same way you interact with the world around you in an isometric RPG like Pillars of Eternity. There's less parkouring around rooftops to find glowing chests that play sound effects, and more right-clicking on chests at ground level that you've highlighted with the Highlight Interactables button, but it's the same principle. The NPCs in Defiance Bay are no more mobile than the NPCs in Paradise. When you come across two NPCs arguing in Pillars, the game will just start the conversation from farther away to represent you walking in on them. This kind of conversation starter works a lot better in an abstracted isometric view, possibly also with descriptive text about how the NPC is looking down at a glass they're cleaning or whatever to justify not noticing your weird face right away. Despite a first-person view theoretically being more immersive, it opens itself up to greater scrutiny about clunkiness like this. But it was also something I was able to acclimate to as just a quirk of the game. I'm not sure everyone would be as forgiving. So with the new, allegedly more immersive perspective that actually introduces new ways to break immersion and the superficial similarity to Skyrim, I can at least understand people coming into this game with misguided expectations, especially if they didn't see Obsidian desperately trying to manage expectations by saying they were not including all of the same Elder Scrolls systems. Then again, when you leave the cities, comparing Avowed to Skyrim suddenly tips much more in Avowed's favor. When you're in the wilderness and the only interaction you can expect with the world is wander around, fight monsters, find treasure, there wouldn't be many immersive sim-type elements in Skyrim or Oblivion anyway, and Avowed's more exciting combat, ability to climb things, and mildly more varied quest design helps the game shine. While not every quest is a winner, quite a few of them involve interesting conversations that use a delightfully reactive and expressive dialogue system, which Skyrim and Oblivion lack. Oh, also, Avowed has a lot of bear enemies, and not once did I hear that stock bear roar. You know the one. It's in everything, including Skyrim. Once I started noticing it in media, I couldn't stop noticing it, and now you're cursed with knowledge too. It's the Wilhelm scream for bears. And I didn't hear it once in Avowed. Maybe it is in the game and somehow it didn't trigger in any of my many bear fights, but I'm pretty sure it's not here, so point to Avowed. I'd like to stop comparing Avowed to Skyrim and Oblivion now, and instead compare it to, well, Pillars of Eternity. I know I just said that much of the world design feels like the Pillars games, and recognizing that helped me enjoy Avowed more, but also Avowed, as an action RPG, lacks a lot of the intricate character building systems that I think are some of the Pillars games' greatest strengths. My biggest disappointment in this area was not a surprise and easy to move on from, but still unfortunate: the lack of the disposition system. The Pillars of Eternity disposition system is one of my favorite role-playing systems in all of RPGs, where you will often get dialogue options mapping on to one of 10 basic personality traits, and you slowly build up a reputation for having those traits that you can then leverage later on in the game. I love it for the huge variety in character role-playing it can lead to and the reactivity you get from NPCs, and I've talked more in depth about it in my earlier video. I hadn't seen any sign of this system in Avowed's previews, so I was prepared for the disappointment. But it's a disappointment nonetheless. I also wish that grimoire customization was still a thing, where you could actually swap out the spells in a given grimoire to more carefully customize a given spell loadout, instead of needing to rely on a grimoire simply having the spells you want already in it. I guess this is somewhat balanced out by the fact you can permanently learn spells on level ups, but it does feel a little less flexible, especially with grimoires only giving you 4 spells at a time. If Obsidian changes this in a future update or DLC, disregard that criticism. Similarly, the change from a class-based system to warrior, rogue, and mage skill trees reduces the possible build variation, and the magic spells are all combat-focused. You can't be a cipher, chanter, or priest, which narrows the scope of magic. Yes, I know technically ciphers are psychics and not fully magic, but they function like spellcasters. That said, I don't see this as a flaw in Avowed, because the narrower ability scope facilitates the action RPG genre. It's something that would have been cool to have, but the game works fine without it. If there's a Pillars 3 in isometric form, though, I would be very disappointed if those classes, the disposition system, and other features didn't return. Also, it's not the Avowed team's fault, but I really miss Justin Bell as the composer. Avowed's music might grow on me in time, but right now I feel like it's just kind of there. Okay, so after listening to the score during editing, I can say that it's good fantasy ambiance, but my preference is for musical score to be more melodic and motif-driven. So it's not what I like in a score, but it does its job. Something that is unexpectedly carried over is the slow burn narrative. I know that for many people, Pillars of Eternity 1 had a boring and unengaging narrative because of its slow start. The great admiration I have for its story is largely because of how tightly written it all is, and how well everything fits together on a thematic level with a cleanness and finesse that is extremely rare in RPGs, let alone video games generally. But unfortunately, that quality isn't clear until after you've reached the end and gotten the whole picture, and there isn't an especially strong plot hook to extrinsically motivate a player character. Avowed is better about having an initial hook, with a clear setup of the envoy's role in the political situation of the Living Lands and multiple attempts on their life. But the game doesn't have as strong a moment of thematic unification. I think Avowed is a slow burn story that really picks up at the end of Emerald Stair, halfway through the game. But the way things resolve don't fully enhance the slower parts in retrospect like in Pillars 1. Something that took me off guard was how important the events of the prior Pillars games are to this game, and how much my enjoyment came from the dramatic irony of knowing huge secrets about the setting that the other characters don't. There are so many references to Eothas' rampage in the Deadfire that are enriched by a knowledge of what those events really were in Pillars 2. There's a side quest in Avowed where you encounter a godlike of Eothas, which is probably my favorite quest in the game, and while I think it stands on its own, his feelings towards his god carry even more meaning if you remember the peek into the relationship between Eothas and Saint Widwin you get to see in the Pillars 2 Beast of Winter DLC. In another side quest, you can find a tiny chunk of the lost moon Ione Brother, and it's a mystery what happened to that moon unless you've played the Pillars 1 White March DLC. The adventures of the Watcher of Cadnua resulted in consequences that the rest of Eora has not had time to truly realize yet, beyond the disappearances of most godlike and the gods going even quieter than they used to be. While it fades from prominence after you leave Dawnshore, with one notable exception in how you can talk down the main villain, there's a strong through line at the start of the game about crises of faith in the wake of these developments.
We live in a time of disbelief. The gods are absent and have recalled their gifts from the world. Avarice reigns. Acquisition is the faith to which all men bow.
It feels strangely fun to know so much about things everybody can only speculate about, including your own character, in a completely different way to just replaying Pillars 1. It's less like you're admiring how things fit together with hindsight and more appreciating a slew of brand new perspectives. I'm not sure how players starting with Avowed will view these moments, but I had a great time with them. Additionally, I'd imagine the mystery of whose godlike you are is not necessarily an intriguing hook for someone just starting with Avowed who has no idea what a godlike even is. I, at least, was hooked right from character creation as I noticed that the godlike features that are there do not conform to any of the Eoran deities I was familiar with. Avowed even takes pains to preserve the main plot twist from Pillars 1 about the nature of the gods, which is pretty bold considering this knowledge reveals a crucial dimension to the motivations the gods have for their role in Avowed's story. I'll get into the specifics later, but suffice it to say for now that someone only playing Avowed is missing a pretty massive piece of the puzzle, and while there are hints about it, those likely won't mean much to an Eoran novice. So there is a tension at the heart of Avowed between going full Skyrim and going full Pillars, and the game does neither and also doesn't achieve a perfect synthesis. I understand anyone who thinks that Avowed is the worst of both worlds, the simplified systems of the Elder Scrolls games but the non-interactivity with the world of the Pillars games. I don't feel that way because while the synthesis is imperfect, I think it's still good. Because it's not calling itself Pillars of Eternity 3, I am willing to set aside certain expectations and allow Avowed to depart from its predecessor, even as I appreciate the connections that do exist. And, most importantly, Avowed does succeed in something that has always been one of Obsidian's strengths: satisfyingly branching dialogue that allows for a lot of leeway in how the player can define their character. Even if many dialogue choices are just for flavor and don't have long-term impacts, it's the flavor I play RPGs to taste. The character background that you can define in creation comes up a lot to provide unique dialogue options, and I found the court augur background really fun. I've long wanted to play a character like this in an RPG, a cryptic weirdo who is shrewd and even knows things they shouldn't. But it's very rarely possible because in most games the main character's knowledge of the situation is necessarily limited and they're forced to behave in straightforward ways. In Avowed, I can finally play someone like a young Kreia or a Morrigan from Dragon Age. The frequency of stat checks and dialogue is thankfully back from the Pillars games. They don't always unlock unique paths to take. Sometimes it's as simple as, my character has high might, so they can make an offhand comment about their strength and then move on. But this is paired with stat checks that do actually unlock new situations in a way that creates a bit more unpredictability. Some of these skill checks might result in outcomes you don't want. It's worth actually paying attention to what you're saying. There's generally a good variety between helpful, wisecracking, and rude options you can give to everyone you talk to. As with KOTOR 2, it was quite common for me to have my own reaction to something I was presented with, and then see that, to my delight, there was a dialogue option to say that very thing. Like this moment in Thirdborn when a guy is talking about following graffiti while standing right in front of some. And most enjoyably, there are regularly moments where you're asked for your opinion on something and you get a whole host of different options that don't have in-game consequences, but help you better define and roleplay your character. I found it actually possible to roleplay character development for my envoy, as she began with the intent of advancing Adir's goals, but soon bought into the promise of a free living lands. The Court Augur backstory involves a talented but impoverished seer being swept up into court drama, and so I decided mine wanted independence and autonomy, but had this desire ground out of her by courtly intrigue until she rediscovers it in the living lands. And I was actually able to play out this arc. I find many RPGs don't work well if you attempt character development through your playthrough, and instead it's more optimal to choose a way to play it at the start and stick with it the whole time. Wrath of the Righteous is perhaps the best RPG I've played that does facilitate PC development, though Pillars of Eternity does this too. While Avowed isn't perfect about this, it provides the possibility, especially considering how often you get the chance to explain your thinking behind certain choices to other characters, and how these options regularly allow different levels of loyalty to the Emperor. I think this quality of Avowed's dialogue tree design is the main element that elevates it as an RPG. At least in the mechanics sense. It's fun to walk around as a court augur and freak people out with cryptic nonsense, and it's fun to have this variety of ways to speak to NPCs. That matters to me much more than, can I put a bucket over this shopkeeper's head and steal their entire stock from under their nose? Or does this NPC have a schedule that vaguely mimics having an affair but never means anything beyond being fun trivia? Don't get me wrong, that Oblivion trivia is fun, but it's not the be-all end-all of what makes a good RPG. So basically, Avowed is in a weird place when directly compared with Elder Scrolls and Pillars of Eternity, but it is a well-crafted adventure with fun gameplay and a robust dialogue tree that's typical for Obsidian. It's the minimum I was hoping for, and I got a fair amount beyond the minimum. But stories matter to me in video games, especially for RPGs, not just mechanics. So how is Avowed's story? And how does it relate back to Pillars of Eternity? Avowed follows the Envoy, the chosen representative of the Adiran Emperor, to travel to the living lands in order to investigate a plague of the soul called the Dream Scourge that has emerged out of the island. The Living Lands is known for its improbably varied ecological terrain and has become the site of a number of settlements of people seeking to escape the confines of existing civilizations. But Adir has set its sights on making the whole place a colony. The setup is pretty similar to Obsidian's prior game Tyranny, where you also play as a trusted agent of an Imperial entity sent to manage a crisis in a prospective territory, with the game's events offering the opportunity for this character to either affirm their loyalty to their master or rebel and attempt to undermine these efforts. In line with the earlier two Pillars of Eternity games, Avowed is a game about imperialism. The first game dealt with the concept more as one manifestation of the broader theme of the past's effect on the present, considering the actions of the Ingwithans, and the way the background lore of the Dyrwood and Air Glonfoth is drawing direct inspiration from the United States and the many Native American tribes. The second game brings the theme into direct focus, as the Deadfire Archipelago is in the midst of a struggle between its native Huana tribes, the territorial interests of their cousin Aumaua nation Rauatai, and the economic desires of the Vailian republics. That aspect of Pillars 2 is a lot more interesting and fleshed out than the main plot chasing Aethys as he marches through the archipelago. But anyway, this isn't a review of Pillars 2. Avowed has a pretty interesting approach to the theme, because it presents a more complicated situation than the indigenous versus colonizer dynamic that we can see with the Glanfathans versus the Adirans, and then the Raed Sarans and Dyrwoodans. The Adiran Empire wants to exert its influence over the living lands, and the people who have settled there rather like their freedom, thank you very much. But these people are themselves settlers, having moved to a vacant land that had already seen its initial civilization get wiped out long ago. Some, like the Pargrunan dwarves, have established their own deep roots here, but they are still engaged in battles against the living part of the living lands. The natural world on this island is always shifting, even before the latest Dream Scourge crisis that emerged after the Adirans came. There's a strong environmentalist undercurrent to this game in how the non-Adiran inhabitants of the living lands have what could be seen as their own imperialist struggle against nature. Real-world colonialism has often used rhetoric of, this land has no civilization, so it's perfect for us to set up ours, even though most of the time there was, in fact, a civilization that the colonial side simply didn't recognize as legitimate.
They go, you can't claim us, we live here. 500 million of us. Do you have a flag?
In the living lands, the ancient people known as the Godless are long dead, so for the people of Paradis, Fior Messiverno, Thirdborn, and Solace Keep, this actually was a land devoid of civilization before they set up shop. This is something the companion Kai even points out directly if you compare the Rauatai's actions in the Deadfire with Adir's approach to the living lands. But there is still the matter of environmental exploitation, most notably in Fior Messiverno, where the Animancers have been manipulating the soul energy of the land for farming. Avowed does not condemn these living land cities as inherent evil imperialists, or endorse anti-civilization eco-terrorism and leaving the island to the ghosts of the godless or anything like that, but it does ask the player to consider how exploitation of the environment can parallel the exploitation inherent to colonialism. As conveyed with two quests in which the envoy can peacefully negotiate with nature beings called Delimgon, it is possible to live in cooperation with nature instead of as its adversary, though doing so is easier said than done, as the Godless did so but still struggled against how mercurial nature can be. The game's handling of this theme is complicated and a little messy, but in a way that I feel invites deeper engagement rather than just writing it off as poorly done, though of course each person will have their own line between those two judgments. Another major theme intertwined with imperialism is how can one truly get a fresh start or second chance? The progression of regions in the game as the envoy journeys through the living lands works as a fairly obvious visual metaphor for the ways the initial excitement of a fresh start slowly erodes into struggle and hardship. Dawnshore is a lovely coastal grassland with some danger out in the wilds, but most danger coming from Adir's presence and the new Dream Scourge, which only sparsely appears here. Emerald Stair is heavy forest with some freakiness in how the Vailian expatriates are using reanimated corpses to farm, demonstrating innovative but drastic methods of survival. Then a major plot beat happens to upend everything, and the next area is Shatterscarp, a desert, and Dream Thralls are absolutely everywhere and much of the game's early whimsy fades. The land is barely hospitable and only getting worse with the ravages of the plague, and while the first two areas' civilizations are mostly secure but problems are mounting, Thirdborn is already in crisis. The last area, Galawain's Tusks, is a volcanic wasteland, featuring a civilization that has figured out how to eke out a secure survival, but these methods are taking an active toll on those living in it. Each area escalates the inhospitability as the excitement of new adventure gives way to the painful hardship of sustaining one's second chance. Now, this is hardly a groundbreaking approach to environment design. Starting with a grassland and ending with a lava land is as basic as you can get. Though Avowed's final dungeons aren't lava-themed, but you know what I mean. By reflecting these changes in environment with the game's portrayal of constant negotiation with nature, Avowed can add at least one layer of extra meaning onto this design cliché. That negotiation is at the core of the game's narrative. Soon into the Envoy's investigation into the Dream Scourge, they end up mentally connected to a strange presence in the island's Audra veins, referred to as a mysterious voice until it is named at the end of Emerald Stair, and so I'll avoid saying their name until the spoiler section. But it is obvious from the get-go that this being is, in some way, a reflection of the island itself, some kind of representative of the place's nature. Early interactions do not inspire trust, but it is also obviously receptive to learning from choices the envoy makes and what the envoy says to them. It's a conceptual cousin to the Dream Visitor from Baldur's Gate 3, another presence in your head that guides and protects you but can't help but have a sinister undercurrent. While the Dream Visitor obviously had an agenda and was intentionally keeping secrets, this voice seems less calculating and more willing to value your input. It is watching you, incorporating your choices into its own worldview, learning from you, all while insisting that you must free it and being cagey and cryptic about what it will do if freed and what it is capable of doing. This entity is likely what will make or break the narrative of Avowed for any given player. If you get into the back and forth and take your role shaping this being's mindset seriously, or at least take it seriously as a character, you will probably really like this game's main story. If you don't, if you're annoyed by it or just don't care how you're influencing it, then chances are you won't feel engaged and won't much care for the overall experience. For me, having this extra consideration for every major choice deepened those moments. The tension of guiding someone I was suspicious of in an attempt to make sure I would feel comfortable doing what they wanted was a fascinating experience that did a lot to make up for my mild disappointment in some of the other major characters. I find the companion writing the weakest element of Avowed's narrative, which is unfortunate because it's the most consistent part of it aside from the voice. It's another thing that reminds me of Tyranny, actually, in that the main story and interactions with major non-party characters are interesting and convey the game's themes well, but I didn't find the party all that memorable after I finished playing. Lantry and Yatsley are really similar characters as eccentric elder wizards with a hedonistic side, now that I think about it. At least Tyranny has Barrack and Siren as more standout companions, and I don't think Avowed's party members measure up to either of them. That's not to say these companions are bad, just underbaked to varying extents. In my Mass Effect and Dragon Age retrospective, I outlined the 6 main qualities that make RPG companions appeal to me. They are: 1. A fun initial conceptual hook to make them stand out as soon as you meet them. 2. Being their own people, not just representatives of whatever group or faction in the setting they may come from. 3. A distinct and memorable personality that, if not likable, at least contributes to interesting characterization. 4. Well done character development over the course of a side story that centers them. 5. They explore the game's main themes, ideally in nuanced, complementary, and not redundant ways. 6. Visual diversity, so they stand apart from each other. And for a bonus point, companions may have fleshed out dynamics with each other instead of just with the player character. A companion doesn't necessarily have to meet every single one of these in a checklist for me to think they're good, as excelling in one area can make up for not doing as well in another. Case in point, the vibrant personalities and strong character arcs of the Baldur's Gate 3 party make up for what I see as fairly repetitive explorations of that game's themes. With the Avowed cast, criteria 2 and 6 and the bonus are handily met, but they struggle with the others. They technically do meet all of them, but in more limited ways than better RPG parties. The main areas of weakness are points 1 and 4, I think, with only Yatsley having a hook that goes beyond just archetype and backstory, and a lack of companion quests for Yatsley and Giada hindering their ability to stand out. But before getting into all of that, it's notable that companions interjecting in dialogue can be a bit janky at times. When companions make side remarks in conversations with NPCs, it seems that the game plays the interjections of both followers, even if they say basically the same thing, and they don't often react to what each other said. Sometimes they might, and it's good, but often they don't, and it makes these remarks strange and artificial feeling. In Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, companions frequently react to each other's reactions rather than simply going down the line giving isolated quips like they do in Avowed. And I wish this game did that instead. It's a minor quibble, and I mostly noticed it just in Emerald Stair, but it can build up to more significant annoyance at times. I am sympathetic to the fact that these side conversations are easier to do in Pathfinder when that game does not have full voice acting, and so they're cheaper to add and make expansive variants on. But still, it can be jarring in Avowed. Don't get me wrong, I do want RPG companions to have regular interjections in dialogue. And much of the time in Avowed, it's appreciated. It's just that it's also common for this weird redundancy to happen, especially when Kai and Marius are both in the party, which is going to be the case for much of the first half of the game before you recruit Giada and Yatsley.
Whatever you all are doing, it's clearly working wonders so far.
And how's that risk-taking working out for you?
Avowed's companion banters at camp are a lot better and more natural, and it's really fun to have the whole party chiming in sometimes. It's always nice when banter can be more than just one-on-one. The companions warm up to each other quickly, in part because Kai and Marius are already well acquainted and Yatzli and Giada are practically family. There's no Durance being a weird freak to everybody, though one could perhaps consider Marius' glumness a much milder version of that. He and Kai bicker constantly, and he's a bit abrasive with Giada and Yatzli, but they're all fast friends, and Marius and Kai ribbing each other is more brotherly jabs. And it's nice that many of their banters reveal new sides to their personalities or backstories that they don't mention when talking to the envoy. As I absorbed their banter, their interjections, and their in-gameplay bark lines, I found myself pondering the nature of quippy dialogue in 2020's media. I see a lot of criticism from internet randos who consider quippiness to be inherently bad writing, which is an absurd absolute. It's a creative choice that has a particular effect, that effect often being bathos and deflating tension. Whether or not that effect is desired is going to depend on a lot of different factors, including the broader situation, the established characterization of whomever is speaking, the overall tone of the story and what it would mean for the tone to change, and many more. The fatigue of 15 plus years of MCU dominance and close to 30 years of Joss Whedon's massive influence has led to, in some cases, knee-jerk rejection of writing that resembles the style. I guess I get it, since the context of a work will inevitably influence perception of it, and the entire point of complaining about something like cliché or problematic tropes is based on common factors across works rather than flaws with any single work in isolation. But at the same time, writing off entire modes of speech feels arbitrary, and would just flip the pendulum on what is considered overdone to dry, morose self-seriousness until Whedon-esque dialogue, or some other incarnation of irreverent breeziness, becomes fresh and exciting again. When it comes to Avowed's use of such language, I noticed that it is limited to the companions and a scattered handful of NPCs. This is true of most RPGs that indulge in quippy banter, actually. Most NPCs, with some exceptions, will speak in more formal or flowery language.
This is a spring from which the dream scourge flows, injecting poison into the veins of the island.
I have had the great privilege to speak with thousands of our kind during my long life. And you do not resemble a single one of them.
He planted Solace Keep here, in the spot where it first spoke to him, and charged his people to forever protect it from all who might threaten its peace.
There's nothing to be done. All we can do is brace for the inevitable, though it may damn us in the end.
While companions tend to interject more jokes and one-liners.
That's a powerful accusation to make. I know you Rangers are a tight bunch.
Come on. You're not still mad about that hunting knife, are you?
This makes the companions feel more familiar to the player in their mannerisms, even more like you might expect another person in a tabletop game to act, like video game RPG companions were originally intended to emulate. That's not to say that such companions shouldn't feel like they come from the fictional world the game is set in, as I think most of the time they should, unless there's a good story reason for otherwise. And in Avowed's case, I think they do. Kai's past in the Rawatai Navy is well established, and his casualness reflects his disillusionment. Marius feels surrounded by idiots and doesn't want to get close to people after running from Solace Keep. Giada is a passionate believer in Fior Messiverno's ideals of freedom who tends to be more earnest, while Yatzli's time in Fior with an extremely loving husband has given her more of a loose, free spirit attitude. The most important thing for me is whether or not quippy dialogue is rooted in character, and the second most important thing is if the quips are actually funny, which is a lot more subjective. The reason the humor value is secondary to character value is that maybe a hypothetical character is supposed to be trying too hard to be funny, and if other characters react accordingly, there can be some fun anti-humor from it. Avowed's moments of companion humor are grounded in their characters, and they all know to get serious when things are actually dire. Maybe Giada's jokes aren't as well rooted in who she is, but she's also the least likely to try to make a quip anyway. I find Marius pretty annoying, though.
Oh, we've got a real Kamayu here. Wonderful.
He's firmly my least favorite companion, or at least when ignoring his personal quest. While his quips do come from character, we now reach my second consideration, humor value, and here his remarks fall flat way more than the others, unless they are specifically about those others, in which case they tend to land more often. More than anyone else, Marius' quips fall into the, let me get this straight, now I'll describe the situation back at you with a snide tone kind of quips that tend to feel lazy and generally lack actual wit.
One of my books refers to Nemnod as a god, the immortal eater of worlds.
Right. That sounds wonderful.
I get that he's gained his perspective partly from seeing so many other people try and fail to survive in the wilderness in dumb ways, but his one-liners often feel like the kind of lines people who hate quips think all quips are like.
That's something I hope never happens again.
Also, it feels weird for him to keep dropping Lember vocabulary into his dialogue with a generic American accent. There is a missable line if you take him around Galawain's tusks, where he'll mention to another dwarf that he suppressed his accent on purpose after he ran away from Solace Keep. So there is an in-character reason for this, but that doesn't stop it from feeling weird. Maybe if he kept his accent for just the Lember words, it wouldn't be so odd. It is, at least, fun to open up the lore glossary to translate what Marius just said. It's a shame he annoyed me so much because once the envoy reaches Galawain's tusks and Marius has to actually face the past he ran away from, he's a lot more interesting. Kai is metatextually interesting because it's obvious he's meant to invoke Garrus from Mass Effect superficially, but he is a very different person underneath. Obsidian got Brandon Keener, Garrus' voice actor, to play the part with the same voice and inflections.
Leaderless and rudderless is the natural state of things in Paradise anyway. Keeps things interesting.
His lines are also written with strikingly similar mannerisms and tones as Garrus's, or at least Garrus' Mass Effect 3 version, where he's the laid-back veteran who will snipe cans with Shepard in the Presidium and trade specious jokes with Joker. I guess in Mass Effect 1, when he's the C-Sec officer who hates rules that stop him from doing police brutality, he's a bit less breezy. But that leads into where Kai and Garrus diverge. Garrus' arcs in the first two Mass Effects were all about his yearning for vengeance, and whether or not Shepard allows him to pursue vigilante retaliation or encourages him to let things go. Kai, meanwhile, is the exact kind of person Garrus would try to kill, a rogue with a messy past full of regrets, who participated in a lot of bad things during his time in the Deadfire. Garrus has to learn how to forgive others, while Kai has to learn how to forgive himself for a particular personal failing, and frequently expresses appreciation for the idea of giving second chances to other characters. Kai, as the first companion you recruit and someone who abandoned Rauatai's imperialism only to now be facing Adir's version, believes in and represents the ideal of the Living Lands as a place of second chances and renewal. Perhaps in another life, in a time before Widewin, he would have been a priest of Aethys. Maybe he was. This is a setting with confirmed reincarnation, after all. Despite that, it's interesting to note that Kai is also the only companion even willing to entertain the idea that Adir could have benefits for the Living Lands. He has his idealism about what the Living Lands can mean to people, but his own pragmatic view of survival. I like Kai not just because he reminds me of Garrus. His one-liners tend to clearly come from an active desire to break tension and to not let things bother him, which is less grating than Marius, and the moments he gets serious land especially well. It's also nice, albeit sometimes repetitive, how he regularly checks in on how the envoy is feeling, because it gives the player extra opportunity for self-definition and articulating in-character reasoning for certain choices. His struggles with his regrets are well conveyed, especially early on. Giada has a very classic hero's journey setup. She's a gifted animancer with the legacy of her also gifted parents to live up to, but she lost her parents in a tragic accident. She's grown up to become headstrong and rebellious in the face of her hometown's inept leadership and is known as a troublemaker. But she is willing to break the rules to get things done and defend it, to the point of being outright exiled for her trouble, which only frees her to strike out on her own. The main wrinkle is that her vocation is animancy, the controversial manipulation of souls that has the potential to go disastrously wrong even as it could lead to huge breakthroughs, as we saw in Pillars 1. This gives her a likable and earnest passion for things other characters are sometimes freaked out by. I feel like Giada has quite a lot of potential as a character with an especially strong start, but unfortunately after she leaves Fior, she's mostly just there, tagging along with the group until a personal breakthrough in the final area instead of having her own side quest like Kai and Marius. She is, at least, directly tied enough to the conflict with the Steel Garrote and a passionate opponent of Adiran dominance to make her worth taking along, but without a dedicated side quest, she feels incomplete. Same with Yatzli, who gets the spotlight when you have to take her with you to finish the Shatterscarp arc, and then gets her own breakthrough in the final area, but not much beyond that in terms of development. Giada and Yatzli are both enjoyable to have around, and they provide good perspectives when they interject in conversations, and they do set things up in camp conversations that are resolved by their final area scenes, so at least they have something going on. I do appreciate the camp conversations, like those Giada has with the Envoy about her struggles with her family legacy and questioning whether or not she should continue with animancy in the wake of her exile and everything else that happens to her. And one of my favorite moments with her is when she contemplates changing her approach to animancy after a side quest in Galawain's Tusks where the Envoy can negotiate with a Delimgon to work cooperatively with the Pargrunan. Giada wonders if there is a way for animancy to work more in harmony with nature than in opposition to it, harkening back to the game's broader environmentalism. Yatzli just tells you about a dream she has, and then you learn the meaning of the dream. I don't care much about it. That said, there is thematic meaning to the difference between Kai and Marius' questlines and Giada and Yatzli's more background journeys. The two men are grappling with past traumas that are holding them back from fully embracing the second lives they have been looking for in the Living Lands. Meanwhile, the two women are less directly stifled by their pasts. Giada does have trauma, but her camp talks are less about that and more about her future with animancy. Giada and Yatzli are at decision points where they have to choose what their second lives will be. Kai and Marius are letting go of their pasts. Giada and Yatzli are selecting their futures. Two sides of what it means to start a new life for yourself. It's the outline of something really meaningful, but again, I wish there were full quests for the two women. Meanwhile, Kai's questline is just going to a few places and him talking to the Envoy rather than having more direct drama like Marius' quest. As a result, it does not stand out as well from other conversations, even if I think these dialogues themselves are quite good. While show don't tell can be an overused and misapplied criticism, it feels like an appropriate note to give the character arc of one of the most important characters in the game. That said, I guess it's a bit of a borderline case because Kai's dialogues are sort of showing through telling. So while one would think having a smaller party of companions means more opportunity to deeply develop them, Avowed's small party does not live up to the standards of the companions in the first Pillars game. But, you know, they are better written characters than every follower in Skyrim, so I guess there's that. Yes, even Serana. I find the side characters much better, at least within the context of their roles. Giada may have more depth than the murderer of Fior Messiverno's missing ranger quest, for example, but as the antagonist of a side quest, that murderer is pretty interesting and can afford to be more one-note. Or two-note, as it turns out. And there are a lot of NPCs like this. The Aethys godlike Sargamas, who has a deeply complex and turbulent relationship with his creator. Archmage Ringgrim, whose bored, big-picture perspective is captivating. Captain Nugunu, whose self-interest and desire for finer things is entertainingly scummy. Ambassador Veilguard, whose beleaguered haughtiness is made extra amusing if you read his note revealing he's turned on by how scared he is of Inquisitor Ludwin. More like Ludwin, am I right, gamers? If any one of these characters, or any of the other good ones I didn't mention, were to be thrust into the role of companion, they would need extra spice. Well, maybe not Sargamas. But they fulfill their side character roles well. They consistently demonstrate compelling depth within their more limited screen time. And then there's the mysterious voice. What the game does with this character fascinates me, and okay, I don't think I can continue while tiptoeing around spoilers. If you're going to skip ahead to the conclusion or stop watching here, I'll just close out the character section by saying that the underbaked nature of the companions is a shame, but I really like a lot of the various quest NPCs we interact with, and that helps drive my interest in the narrative. There are other RPGs that are better about its characters, especially companions, but there's also a lot of RPGs that are way worse. Okay, spoilers ahead for Avowed, and also for both Pillars of Eternity games. The mysterious voice in the Envoy's head is a god, the one the Envoy is a godlike of. Sapadal. They are, as I said before, a fascinating character, made even more interesting with the context of where the Aoran pantheon came from that Pillars veterans would know. The first Pillars game is about learning the truth of the gods, that they are artificial animancy constructs created by amalgamating thousands of sacrificed Ingwithan souls, to embody Ingwithan values and impose order and purpose onto a world that the Ingwithans deemed purposeless without them. Sapadal is not one of these gods. They emerged out of the godless, or Ekedans, who first settled the living lands. The Adravanes in the island were cut off from the rest of the world, and in this isolation the Ekeda lived and died and reincarnated, and eventually many of their souls accumulated and amalgamated into the entity that became Sapadal, a god of nature created naturally. The rest of the gods, as Engwithan constructs, saw this new god as a threat, and Woedica resolved to imprison Sapadal, completely cut them off from the world, and eventually sent the Steel Garrote under Ludwin to return and finish the job, sparking the plot of Avowed. So Sapadal is a repudiation of the gods like Woedica on an existing level. The mass self-sacrifice of the Engwithans that traumatized Theosix Arcanon led up to the effective lobotomy of Abaddon and is the reason for the actions of the Leaden Key could be seen as proven to be all for nothing. But that's not all. Yatzli's studies have led her to believe that the Ekedans came to the living lands from faraway Engwithan lands, and tablets of theirs that Sargamas studied mention the Engwithans. It seems likely that the Ekedans left the Engwithans because they objected to the plan to create the gods and wanted to live their own lives, away from what their compatriots had decided to do.
There was some kind of schism, an ideological one. From what I can glean, the godless were staunchly against the gods, hence their name. There are even some not-so-kind murals of the gods.
They probably created the closed Adra loop themselves for this very reason, and this adds yet another meaning to Sapadal's existence being inherent rebellion. Without even trying to, without doing anything more than living their lives, the Ekedans accomplished the creation of a god by accident, while it took the Engwithans they left behind mass sacrifice and then concerted efforts at erasing all evidence. It's acknowledged by the Envoy and the party, especially Giada, that Sapadal's existence poses a threat to the supremacy of the gods, but none of them truly understand the depths of that truth because they don't know what the gods really are. But with full context, it lays bare the full hypocrisy of the gods, whose emissaries declare them the real gods and Sapadal a false one, as well as implies a statement about the hypocrisy of colonialism itself. It is hypocritical, says Avowed, for a culture to deem itself the only way of true civilization by dismissing any counterexamples, any instances of other cultures actually managing to match their achievements as somehow not counting or being false.
No flag, no country. You can't have one. That's the rules that I've just made up. And I'm backing it up with this gun.
It is true that Sapadal is wilder, less controlled than the other gods. Sapadal is younger, with a childlike mentality and a demonstrated history of lashing out at the Ekedans and not being able to accept responsibility for such outbursts. They are even the unintentional cause of the Dream Scourge, as it is a side effect of them straining against their prison in response to a Diran incursion. This is the justification Woedica uses for her attack on them, and is also the main source of suspicion that the player may feel towards Sapadal, the main motivation I had for trying to guide them towards greater maturity and empathy towards mortals so it would be safe to set them free. But this instability is only an excuse for Woedica, and she would see Sapadal as a threat even if the Ekedan god had emerged as disciplined as she. As I said before, the sense of obligation I felt to guide Sapadal enhanced many of the choices I made, since I not only had to consider the specifics of the situations, but how Sapadal would react to them. If I'm merciful to the Paradisan rebel leader, it might blow up in my face later, but also it might teach Sapadal that mercy is good, and isn't that more important? This was most effective in the final choice of Shatterscarp, which I think is in general the best region of the game. After Emerald Stair, which has some good moments, but is definitely the section that drags the most, Shatterscarp feels like a sudden jolt of revitalization. As a desert, it stands out visually. There's more immediate tension with the Dream Thralls regularly attacking Thirdborn, and the suspicion between the Adiran soldiers in the area and the people of Thirdborn leads to a dynamic political situation like in Paradise, but with its own particular spin. Adventuring into Reengrim's domain is a great section too. Then it all culminates in the Dream Thrall swarm at Naku Kubel and the choice of how to deal with the region's fight against the Dream Scourge and with Inquisitor Ludwin. I really like the game's uses of Ludwin. Obsidian and villains with cool masks name a more iconic duo. She's a pretty decent RPG villain, not great, but she fulfills her role with thematic meaning, and there's a lot of fun ways to interact with her. When Captain Cynric first tells you about Ludwine's presence in Paradise, you get a dialogue option to imply you know her. I've read this is exclusive to the war hero background, but as a court augur, I still got it, so I'm pretty sure everyone does. And then you can choose how you know her, whether you fought together, she mentored you, or if you were lovers, before or after she became a skeleton.
After? Gods help us.
This is why I play RPGs. Anyway, this ability to define a personal relationship with the antagonist helps bring out a bit more depth, as does the way she contrasts with the Envoy on a conceptual level. The Envoy is a godlike of Sapadal, a fate they did not choose for themselves, but a role that they can embrace and make their own. Ludwine chose to devote herself to Woedica, but this binds her into a particularly rigid form of service. And the Envoy has the ability to influence Sapadal, while Ludwine can only obey. Sapadal loves the Envoy as their creation, but to Woedica, Ludwine is just a useful tool. And Ludwine consistently throws an engaging wrench into the plot of the game, because despite Adiran society prioritizing the doctrine of Woedica, the Emperor is not the goddess's direct servant in the same way her devoted paladins are. So Ludwine decides the diplomatic, soft power approach of Ambassador Veilguard is inferior to her violent, hard power approach. This forces Veilguard to ally with the other Living Lands leaders to stop her, and also allows the player to oppose Ludwine while remaining loyal to Adir if they wish. Described that way, it feels like the setup for a very common tendency in mainstream fiction, to displace the negative traits of a morally suspect faction onto an even worse one in order to have a tidier narrative resolution, which I'd argue happens to some extent in Arcane the moment Noxus shows up in Piltover. But not entirely. Watch OSP's detailed diatribe. But Avowed does not avoid the stickiness of Veilguard. When you talk to him, your companions, the other region leaders, and Sapadal, if they're still alive, everyone recognizes that going along with him is still submitting to conquest by another way, and it would still be bad for the Living Lands.
Adiran rule and rule by the Steel Garrote would be markedly different beasts.
Spoken like a fucking diplomat. Splitting hairs, when it all comes from the same head.
Ironically, by mimicking the trope of displace the worst of a bad faction onto an even worse faction, Avowed is able to highlight how there really isn't much displacement happening at all. That's pretty clever. Ludwine also causes a huge complication for the major choice at the end of the Shatterscarp questline because she, the game's main antagonist, is the one who provides what's probably the good option. The setup is that Shatterscarp has been hit especially hard by the Dream Thralls, and a huge horde of them has swarmed around the Akedan ruin of Nakukubel. Ludwine wants to blow up the ruin and kill all the Dream Thralls who have assembled there, which will have the side effect of greatly reducing the pressure of constant attacks on Thirdborn, but it will destroy the Akedan temple that could have valuable secrets inside, and the Dream Scourge itself will still continue to infect Thirdborners, so eventually the Thralls will be replenished. Meanwhile, Archmage Reengrim offers an alternative. Cut off the Audra in Shatterscarp to permanently end the Dream Scourge in the region without destroying the temple, at the cost of an unknown number of locals who will be sacrificed. Of course, since the Envoy is seeking to end the Dream Scourge anyway, it's likely that the temporary reprieve of destroying the temple would last long enough for it not to matter that the Dream Scourge will remain a little longer. The choice would be a simple trolley problem, if not for two main factors that make it much more interesting. As I said, Ludwine is the one offering the probably good choice here. And the fact that she has at this point already attacked and potentially destroyed Fiormessi Verno unprovoked, and made your job as Envoy harder, means the player is likely more hesitant to do what she wants. How might Ludwine benefit from this beyond what she's telling the Envoy, and how much worse might that be in the long run? And then there's Sapadal, who is strongly against Ludwine's plan because they want to preserve what is left of their beloved Akedans. If you're invested in the idea of guiding Sapadal and tempering their worst instincts, as I was, you already know how temperamental they can be, and you don't know if making this choice will cause them to turn at least somewhat against you. So this trolley problem becomes even larger if you wonder whether saving Shatterscarp not only leaves the Dream Scourge intact, but also could benefit the Steel Garrote's broader efforts and could provoke Sapadal's wrath to do something even worse, as you may have seen in multiple memory segments by now. I'm sure the way I played led to this moment being more impactful for me than it will be for everybody. I didn't stop the Steel Garrote from destroying Fior Messiverno, even though I found their cave, because I foolishly thought that clearing out the cave would sequence break and I'd have the chance to come back later. It's awesome that you can thwart them, by the way. Even though the city still gets attacked, you clearing this cave reduces their numbers and means it will survive, which is a pretty major impact you can have on the main plot. But I did see Fior destroyed, so I was much more primed to want to oppose Ludwine and not give the Steel Garrote any more wins. So for me, this was a triumph from Obsidian in crafting a truly difficult choice. I chose to go with Reengrim's plan, end the Dream Scourge at the cost of dozens of innocent lives, and spent the rest of the game knowing I chose wrong but refusing to reload. I loved it. One could fairly criticize the moment as being a little bit contrived by asking why are Ludwine and Reengrim so eagerly allowing the Envoy to make the choice here. I think there are justifications, since Reengrim needs help from Yahtzee to cut off the Adra.
Attune your soul to Sapadal to assist my focus on the Adra. You're the only one who can do that part.
And at this point, Ludwine is trying to be somewhat cooperative with the Envoy, but it still feels a little awkward. There's another use of Ludwine in Galawain's Tusks when the Envoy speaks to the two counselors who rule Solace Keep. It becomes apparent that Mihala is a staunch traditionalist who is leading her people into stagnation and decline. And Kostya is now willing to do anything to break the Pargrunen free from these traditions. Anything, it turns out, includes secretly working with the Steel Garrote to destroy Solace Keep and force the Pargrunen out of their home. It feels very reminiscent of the choice between Harrowmont and Balin in Dragon Age Origins, where you choose between a traditionalist with a good heart and a scheming sociopathic reformer. By positioning the reformer, someone I assume most players would consider to be the good option, as wanting to directly work with the main villain, it not only adds complexity to the situation, but provides a fascinating example of how Kostya has a dramatically different perspective on Ludwine than the Envoy might. This plotline doesn't end up playing out in a Kingmaker scenario like in Orzammar, because Ludwine's desire to kill Sapadal supersedes Kostya's desire to have the Envoy bargain with her. But it is yet another example of aligning the game's obvious villain with the character I imagine many players would consider the good option for compelling in-universe reasons. While Ludwine herself is not terribly complex, with most layers she gets coming from whatever past history you decide happened between her and the Envoy, she works well as a stone tossed into the middle of the story to alter its course around her in cool ways. There's a few things in the game's latter half I just want to briefly shout out as things I particularly liked while we're in the spoiler section. Once we reach Galawain's Tusks, Marius becomes a lot more interesting when we find out his backstory as a childhood survivor of what is essentially Dwarf Jonestown, and his personal quest finding his old compound and the old cult leader who survived but has succumbed to Watcher's madness is quite good. It's fun that this character is a Watcher too, demonstrating a unique version of that madness that the previous Pillars game did not get into. I kind of wish a companion I liked more got such a good quest, but it's likely for the best that my least favorite could get this extra boost. The structure of the climax has an interesting scouring of the Shire feeling to it, as Sapadal had already been slain or freed, and dealing with Ludwine's attack feels a bit like just cleanup, which Giada even outright says. I like how it gives the player a victory lap with a really strong power from Sapadal or Wodika, while also being humbling when you consider how insignificant the Ludwine versus Paradis conflict is after the actual struggle between gods, even if both are the constructs of mortals. And speaking of the climax, running through the camp outside Paradis and then the city itself, and seeing small acknowledgements of choices you've made throughout the game in multiple side quests in the form of NPCs popping up to comment on things or help out or even fight against you, like the ranger murderer if you let her go, is quite gratifying. As much as Kai might wish otherwise, not everyone uses their second chance well. I wasn't expecting so many side characters to reappear in this part, and it was nice to see. One thing I will criticize about the climax is that this is the first real glimpse we get into the politics between Living Land settlements, which is otherwise pretty vague and undefined. Pillars 2 and Tyranny both had dynamic political tensions throughout the game, with factions actively making moves against each other, and it feels like Avowed is setting up something similar while you're in Dawnshore, but instead of moving back and forth between the political entities, the Envoy just goes from one region to the next in order to find the garden, and then gets one final conversation with everyone back in Paradis. I do like how your choice about how to deal with Soppadal, while a binary free or kill choice, can be informed by a huge variety of factors, including your interpretations of the various memory sequences. And I like how this choice is completely separate from what you want to do with the political situation, meaning it's possible your envoy would agree with Woodica that Soppadal is too dangerous and erratic to not threaten the world, but then insist that Adir leave the Living Lands independent. That's not what I did, but you could. Conversely, I appreciate the option to stay an Adir bootlicker the whole way through and even fully side with Ludwig if you want. You know, evil options can be cool. So yeah, generally a good narrative experience. Not Obsidian's best, but Obsidian's less good is still a cut above most of their peers. Well, at least what I've played. I'm not interested in Grounded. At the end of the day, Avowed feels like a good, if mechanically simple RPG that has janky presentation you have to make yourself get over in order to really enjoy it. For an action game, I don't think that's the kind of thing most people will want to take the effort to do, and that's pretty understandable. But for an RPG, that's the price a lot of players have to pay for deeply reactive journeys through rich stories. Not always, of course, and it's better if that's not necessary, but it is still quite common and something I can deal with. Avowed excels in accounting for so many little things, like whether or not you've just used an elevator that two Paradise guards tell you to stay away from. And it has one truly compelling narrative element that elevated the whole thing for me. As a Pillars of Eternity fan, I had a great time, and I'm glad I played it. It is likely the least good of the three journeys we've had in Eora when accounting for everything, but at least its central narrative ties its two main threads together better than Pillars 2. But that said, I definitely would not have bought it at its full $70 price if the success of my earlier video hadn't convinced me I should probably make this as a follow-up. Now, Avowed is a business expense for me, hooray! This wasn't a super in-depth narrative deep dive, but I hope I've still made it clear that I found a lot to dig into and could make such a video in the future, so I'm happy. Avowed feels like another niche Obsidian experience that happened to be shoved into a bigger spotlight than the company is used to. Partly through the reasonably eye-catching price tag, and partly for, well, nonsense. Most of the real criticisms I've heard are things other Obsidian games have faced in the past. If the comment section in my Pillars of Eternity and Baldur's Gate 3 video is any indication, a lot of people found the first game's story boring and unengaging, which is obviously not at all my experience. So hearing similar things about Avowed didn't deter me, and sure enough, I liked it. We'll see if it sticks with me as much as its predecessors or Tyranny, or if it ultimately slips out of my mind like the Outer Worlds. There's apparently DLC plans, and I look forward to what Obsidian comes up with. So, that's the video. Give it a like and a comment if you liked it and have a comment. Check out my other stuff and subscribe if you want to see more. And if you're especially generous, I have a Patreon now with tiers as low as $1, and any support would be super appreciated. Hope you're having a good day.